I was at my desk at the University of New Hampshire that Tuesday morning on October 7th, 2003, when I got the phone call saying, Valerie, they're digging up the street. You know what they found on Chestnut Street?
You know, these bones on the street are not animal bones. They're human. They tell a story. They have a life. They have a history. They have wishes, wants, desires, just like any human being had.
I knew what was under the street at Chestnut Street. A lot of people knew. There was a marker on the corner saying that this is the site of the so-called Negro burying ground. We put that sign there 3 years before the street was dug up. So it's a case of seeing is believing, I suppose. We do know that during the period of time that that burial place was active, the vast majority of the black people in Portsmouth were actually enslaved.
If you go anywhere in New England and you're looking at any of the brochures that promote a town here, you know, it's picturesque, it's the rolling hills, it's the colonial homes, it's the Revolutionary War vets, it's the Civil War. But the minute we include the history of a black person, a person of color, it asks us to look deeper at that history.
The history of African Americans in the North has only been recently discovered, so to speak.
You see references in newspapers and magazines still about how lily white New Hampshire is. New Hampshire has never been lily white, and it is not now.
It's only recently where people are understanding now that there was more to the story. It wasn't just the Pilgrims or the Puritans in Boston. Africans who were brought to New England, they have a story to tell.
American history has never all been kind to the black story, the African story. It's been erased time and time and time again.
In 1779, 20 slaves from Portsmouth petitioned the New Hampshire General Court. They too wanted to share in the freedom that the colonies were seeking.
The last state to adopt the Martin Luther King holiday.
This is 1985. We got 60 votes for Martin Luther King Day out of 400. Can you believe it?
Well, just a little bit slow, but we live free or die. The more we tell the stories and the more that we realize that, that this is not black history, this is our story. This is the American story.
Fort William and Mary. Hey, some people have studied up.
Once you include a black history, you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to the town? What does it mean to the individual person who cherishes a certain ideal of New England?
Black people have been invisible people in this country. It's convenient to not see what you don't want to see, I suppose.
So today we're going to continue on some of the work we started some months ago now, I think it is, in looking at Portsmouth Black history and how we talk about it and how we tell our visitors the importance or the stories that come up around Black history here in Portsmouth and New Hampshire. and trying to get over some of the hurdles we may have. Our last talk, we did a little bit about words and what maybe a comfortable. Raising young men of color in New Hampshire, as my sons were little growing up, I considered myself to that point a Jamaican living in America. Even though I was a citizen, I was still a Jamaican living in America. So with the kids, I had to learn what it meant to be black in this country, because they were considered black, they were considered African American, they were considered Latinos, they were considered everything else but who they were. So I had to then learn what it meant to be black in this country. I had never really been exposed or really did any history class or anything, again, like busy raising kids. So that was my first quest into African American history. But then when you're looking at African American history, most of it was Southern.
This is the New Hampshire story. We happen to be in Portsmouth, and so of course our focus is here in Portsmouth. But I have come to realize that in my travels around the state, sometimes people get the impression that Portsmouth was the only place that had slavery or a black community in New Hampshire. So that's not true. Many of the towns in colonial New Hampshire had slaves, and slavery did exist beyond Portsmouth. So my name is Valerie Cunningham. I'm from Portsmouth. I was born and raised in Portsmouth. And I went through Portsmouth schools, of course. We lived in the South End on Gardner Street. And of course, Strawberry Bank, before it was Strawberry Bank, was one of those areas that was going to be demolished by urban renewal. So when I was in junior high and high school, that was during the 1950s, I was very much aware of the civil rights movement, kept up to date on some of the civil rights activities. I also was working part-time at the public library. So I was reading about colonial Portsmouth. I was reading about Black history when I could find it. There wasn't that much available. Looking for any references I could find to Black people living in Portsmouth. And all of this converged with me then asking the question about Black history in colonial Portsmouth. Well, I always have to talk about the very first aha moment, and that was in the archives at St. John's Church when I found an entry that said, Venus a Black, $1, Xmas Day, Poor Fund. At first, I didn't know how to decode that entry, so I kept looking for the next thing. And it wasn't about Venus, it was about somebody else. Oh, so now I've got to look for that person. And so one thing kept leading to another. And I'm sad to say that all these decades later, I still haven't found any more about that Venus. But I do know how to interpret that. Because Venus was given $1 by the Poor Fund at St. John's Church, we can safely assume, I believe, that she was not enslaved. They would not be giving money to a person who was already owned by a family. So Venus was living probably on her own, unmarried, in need of some assistance. We also know that Venus, although she was not a slave at that time, she had been enslaved, because Venus is not a name that an African mother would give her child. This was the name that a white owner would give his or her slave. Most slave owners preferred young children between the ages of 9 to 12, 14, because they're old enough to be separated from their parents, and they're still young enough to be trained in the way that you want them to be, in the ways of your household. Even now, as I talk to people about slavery in New Hampshire, there's always the temptation to contrast it with the South, because the numbers were larger, the stories are larger, everything seems so much bigger and worse there than here. There is no comparison. When you're talking about the enslavement of human beings, you're talking about slavery, whether it is in the South or in the North, whether it ended then or now or later, it's still slavery. The county records, for instance, where I found wills and household inventories, confirmed the fact that these people were bought and sold and owned and passed from one generation to the next through wills. So obviously they were enslaved people. This shows the slave trade routes. This is the Atlantic slave trade. And you'll see that most of the African people ended up not in North America, but in South America. Now, of course, you see one little arrow goes up to what is now the United States, and it's approximately 5% of the African people who were brought to North and South America. Approximately 5% ended up in this country. The shipbuilders and the merchants of Portsmouth were fully engaged in the transatlantic trade, and that included importing African people to be their servants, in other words, slaves. As the ships came in, there would be an announcement, for instance, in the New Hampshire Gazette, likely boys and girls just arrived from Gambia can be seen at the Long Wharf in Portsmouth. In New England, they were referred to as servants, not because they were treated any better or differently than any place else, but that was just the customary term for people, whether they were enslaved or indentured or otherwise. If you were serving them, you were a servant. So I think that is part of the reason why it was very easy for historians over time to overlook the fact that black people in colonial Portsmouth were in fact enslaved people. They were slaves. 1705 was when the city fathers started mapping out what they called the glebe land. They indicated on the west side of the street the Negro burying ground. People had been buried there from the middle of the 17th century through the end of the 18th century, at which time houses were being built on the street over the burials. How could that happen? It happens all the time, and it did happen all the time to poor people who could not afford to have a monument, whether they were black or white. We have roads all over New Hampshire and all over the country that have been built over somebody's grave. In 2003, they were replacing the very old utilities. The sewer lines and water lines had been installed over 100 years ago. They knew that this was supposed to be the area of the Negro burying ground. And in fact, the very first marker that we installed is on the corner of Chestnut and State Street.
The Court Street Reconstruction Project was a city project. You know, many people in our community, Valerie Cunningham is one of them, reminds us that we did know about the existence of the burying ground. We just couldn't touch it. We didn't know exactly where it was.
They called me into City Hall to meet with the project manager, and we went over the protocols in case something was found here indicating the burial ground.
With Valerie's background and her research, we suspected that the burial ground was pretty much in the area at the intersection of Chestnut and Court Street. And the city had hired my company, IAC, to do some exploratory archaeology in the preceding fall in 2002. We worked with the engineers who explained to us that we're going to go down 18 inches in the sidewalk and 2 feet in the road and 18 inches on the sidewalk. And I said, are you sure that's all we're going to do? And they confirmed that this is the full effect of the project. So we went in 2002 and we had a backhoe cut through all those areas where the engineers told us that we were going to run into, well, as deep as they were ever going to go.
And there was no indication of the burying ground. So the project went on as planned.
And then fast forward to October 7th, 2003, what we all missed was a 6-foot manhole that was going to go in far deeper than those 2 feet we looked the previous fall. Now, they did have a field engineer in place because the whole purpose of his monitoring was just to make sure that that nobody missed anything, because we did have this historic reference to the burial ground being there.
Well, when they reached 8 feet, they hit a board. And at that point, they had the obligation and the good sense to notify the archaeologists.
So I get a phone call a little bit after 8 a.m. saying, we've got something. And I said, are you kidding me? We looked all through there. What do you mean? And we went out there, and there was the base of a 6-sided hexagonal coffin, just fully exposed right where they were installing the new manhole. And that's what started it.
So since that coffin was damaged by law, today's law, it had to be removed.
So we stopped everything. This is great, because this is where the city and the contractors all got on board. Everybody backed away and said, let the archaeologists do their jobs. So that was a Tuesday morning, and by Friday, we knew that one of the graves had a sewer line near it. So, and this was an old ceramic sewer line that was probably put in the 1890s. So we moved a little bit of dirt. We moved a lot of dirt, and I have some photographs of all 6 of my crew in there having moved a lot of dirt. So by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we had opened a very wide area that showed that sewer pipe in the 1880s had cut through a line of graves. And by cutting through them, they actually probably dug into the wooden coffins themselves and actually cut through some of the bone that was left and just cut a narrow trench in order to put this sewer line in. The archaeologist opened a very wide area. And I have to remind people that those Irish workmen and perhaps even black workmen were digging in a narrow trench. And they were digging in a narrow space that was probably 3 to 4 to 5 feet deep. And yes, they pulled out wood. And yes, they pulled out bone. And I imagine some supervisor came back and told them, put that stuff back in there. We don't want to see that. Because that's the exact same story a fellow came and told me who worked on the public water connections in the 1960s. His supervisor told them the very same thing when his crew was working in a narrow trench and pulling out bone, setting it up and saying, we have something here, and they said, we don't want to see any of that, put that back in the ground. I needed to go back to the state archaeologist because I said, if I continue at this pace, we're ultimately going to be uncovering burials from one end of the street to the other. And I think there might be hundreds out here. So we need to work out some kind of plan. And he agreed that if we encountered the coffin wood only and exposed no human remains, we could stop there, which is how we knew there were at least 13 burials, but we only took 8 of them out of the ground.
And those are the coffins underneath that car right there. Those coffins, since they were not damaged, were left in place. We don't know what else is underneath this street.
Because the remains were found in the city's right-of-way, the city worked with the African Burying Ground Committee that was appointed in 2004.
And it was comprised of members of the descendant community. So there was Vernice Jackson and Valerie Cunningham and Kelvin Edwards, Counselor Chris Dwyer, to decide what was going to happen to these remains. And not only what's going to happen to the remains, but the place in which the remains were going back. What was going to happen to that place?
First of all, it is a burial ground, and so we need to have respect for that. And so we need to get the cars off the street and the parking spaces and the parking meters. And our first question was, were they African ancestry?
The science of the DNA testing really merged pretty clearly with the historic records that identified this as a segregated space for Negroes out at that time, which would have been the edge of town. Dr. Bruce Jackson said at least 4 of these are in really good shape, and we can say they are of African descent.
The question then was, are we going to keep calling it the Negro burying ground, or are we going to call it what the people called themselves at that time? So that is now why we call this the African burying ground.
We have, through this process, a long community discussion that's taken place over the past nearly 12 years, decided that it is more right, more just, more appropriate to make sure that this former throughway street be returned to the sacred ground.
So, when our ancestors came to this foreign land, they encountered pain and suffering. When they died, they were placed underneath where we are standing, where these buildings were built. They were forgotten. So they reminded us and said, we are still here. We are still here. And we thirst for your connection. We thirst for your recognition.
We are going to read the names of formerly enslaved Africans and Black Americans of Portsmouth. Anna Sharp, Anna Molyneux, Anna Wise, Archelaus Jaffrey, Becky Quint, Benjamin Abbott, Benefita Walker, Betsy Sampson,
Cyrus Atkinson, Dinah Barney, Diana King, Diana Walker, Dinah Chase Whipple,
Primus Fowl, Prince Harvey Fordham, Prince Jackson, Prince McPhaedrus, Prince Whipple.
Prince Whipple was one of several boys who were brought to Portsmouth during the middle 1700s. The White Whipple family had Prince and Cuffy and a couple other young people in their household. Prince had grown to adulthood in the household as a slave of General William Whipple. It was not unheard of, it was not uncommon even for enslaved people to be literate. If their owners were literate, if they had grown up in a literate family, then they were very likely to be literate themselves. Prince and 19 other enslaved men petitioned the legislature of New Hampshire in 1779, just after the Revolutionary War, for their own freedom and for an end to slavery in New Hampshire. In this petition, they used the language of the revolutionaries and questioned the authority by which these white people had to enslave African people.
The petition of Nero Brewster and others, natives of Africa, now forcibly detained in slavery, in said state most humbly sheweth that the God of nature gave them life and freedom upon terms of the most perfect equality with other men.
The petition was submitted to the New Hampshire legislature. It was published in the New Hampshire Gazette, and it was never brought up for a vote. It was tabled. So no action was taken on this petition.
Viola Freeman, Viola Langdon, Viola Robbins, Viola Neal, Viola Weir, William Clarkson, Windsor Moffitt, Zabloon Gardner, and Zena Walker.
ma ndị nna anyị ha nara mmụọ ka ha bụkwa ndị ga-echeta unu ka ihe ọ bụla unu na-eme na-agara unu ka ngọzi dịkwara unu o ka amara dịkwara unu o ka amara na-edu unu.
Now we can rejoice and say we did the right thing, City of Portsmouth. Give yourselves a hand for caring.
The committee worked with the city staff to go through an RFP process, a national search to find an artist, an outdoor public artist that could help take those ideas from the community and turn them into the final design.
I was delighted when I won the contract. This one was of particular interest because of the fact that, we're talking New England, and, what you learn in school primarily puts most of that focus, all of that focus down in the South and the Caribbean. And then the more I learned about the story that was going on here, I found it to be quite emotional. I came back to Portsmouth and spent about a year researching and meeting people like Valerie and others, and spending a lot of time on the site. And during that year, as a result of that year, came up with the design that we're now in the process of building. So the first challenge was, okay, how do you take what is a city block and restore it to a sense of a sacred place? I've had the opportunity to design the entire site. The first step was, how do you stop traffic in this plaza? You block that off, just stopping it from being a through street. We had to allow traffic to come into two locations on the west side of it for parking. And then what would connect all of that would be this serpentine line. And so where's that line coming from? It appears to be coming from underneath the plaza, basically in the location where the vault is, so that those bodies that had been removed for study could be replaced. And then there is a disc that I'm fabricating in the studio that will basically seal the vault.
This is the circular opening where the lid is going to be. The smaller boxes are going to be placed in prior to the ceremony in this small box on the head. So this is how I found that they fit together like a puzzle.
Some of the boxes would already be put in place because they have to be positioned. Lowering the larger ones into the opening, putting these remains back into the ground.
I was tasked with making the coffins for the remains that they're going to reinter in a ceremonial way. The history that we remember of Portsmouth and the Northeast and New Hampshire is the abolitionist movement. So we like to start in 1820 with Daniel Webster or whatever. And before that, we have our earlier heroes, John Langdon and all these other people, all these famous houses named after them, and they were living in a different time when having slaves or servants was still normal in New Hampshire. We're missing something that's really there, and then to discover this under the pavement and bring it back to the surface and bring it back to our mind and consciousness, that's makes Portsmouth whole.
One of the reasons why this project is just so meaningful for me, because, you know, it takes that thing that was a source of anger, that thing that was a horror, and it acknowledges it, but it puts it in a way that the upliftment of the truth of the matter, the upliftment of our abilities to connect on a high level as opposed to a low level, hopefully will be put forth. It's already determined, rather than reinter those remains that were taken out in the winter, that they would wait until the spring to do that. And we will be installing everything in the spring.
According to the census of 1800, the federal census, slavery had ended in Portsmouth. There were no slaves recorded in the federal census in Portsmouth. However, there were some enslaved people still living in other parts of the state, because New Hampshire, unlike Massachusetts and other New England states, had not ended slavery legislatively.
Ask that question why, then you can start looking at the history. And America's history is much more complex than we even want to think. How we paint the picture of ourselves is much different than what is, depending on whose view you're looking at.
Visitors tend to ask about what's in front of them, and they don't say, gee, did you have slaves in New Hampshire, right? It's invisible. There is nothing to trigger the visitor to ask about that issue.
If the history is not visible and it's not talked about, it doesn't exist. So I do agree with you. The history needs to be visible. I can use my own case in Milford, New Hampshire, when I heard about Harriet Wilson for the first time. I got a scholarship to come to a small junior college in Gadsden, Alabama. And I was 2 years there, and then I have an aunt that lived in New Hampshire, and she said, well, education's much better in the north, so try to come north. And I did. I applied for a scholarship and got a scholarship at New Hampshire College. And then I got married and ended up in Milford. Small town, Milford, typical New England town, you know, soccer mom thing, taking the kids back and forth to games, football, just really active in the kids' life. Not really being part of the community, but being more centered and focused on family. My husband graduated from Milford High. My kids were in the high school, and then it was just little issues here and there, dealing with kids, biracial kids growing up in a town that was very few people of color. I hesitate to say very few, because if you're not involved in the community, you really don't know who's in their community. There are two prominent black families in the community that we were always mistaken for. One of them, the Johnsons. So every time you went somebody said, oh, are you a member of the Johnson family? You know, are you a Johnson? And it was no. In 2002, there was an article in the paper that said that Harriet Wilson, first black author to publish a novel, female author, was born and raised in Milford, and that was my first, very, very first exposure to any black culture in the state of New Hampshire. In the introduction to the book, it talked about Henry Louis Gates discovering that Wilson was a black woman from Milford.
I collect first editions of black texts, and I have a fairly extensive collection. I get the books from University Place Bookshop. It's one of the 2 or 3 specialty shops in rare black books. So I was in there one day, and I noticed a book on the shelf that was called Our Nig. And the reason I thought it was peculiar is that before the end of the Civil War, no title that I knew of had the word nigger or derivative of the word nigger in its title. So I decided to buy it, because one of the things that I study is the image of the black in Western literature. And I picked up the book, I opened it and read the preface, and I was convinced immediately that the author of this book was black and was a black woman.
In offering to the public the following pages, the writer confesses her inability to minister to the refined and cultivated, the pleasure supplied by abler pens. It is not for such these crude narrations appear.
Harriet Wilson, we can call her essentially the mother of all female African American writers in the United States. Our Nig was published in 1859. It was the first novel written by an African American to be published on the North American continent.
I would not from these motives even palliate slavery at the South by disclosures of its appurtenances north. My mistress was wholly imbued with Southern principles. I do not pretend to divulge every transaction in my own life, which the unprejudiced would declare unfavorable in comparison with treatment of legal bondmen. I have purposely omitted what would most provoke shame in our good anti-slavery friends at home.
She was abandoned at the age of 6. She was of mixed ancestry. Her mother was of Irish ancestry. Her father was part African American, part Native American. He died when she was about 5 years old, and when she was 6, her mother essentially just dropped her off at the house of one of the local farmers and kept going, never came back.
She talks about her life in Milford and how she was mistreated by this family.
Where could she sleep? Asked Mary. I don't want her near me. In the L chamber, answered the mother. How she'll get there? Asked Jack. She'll be afraid to go through that dark passage, and she can't climb the ladder safely. She'll have to go there. It's good enough for a nigger, was the reply.
The lady of the house, Mrs. Belmont, in the book, puts her to work. 6-year-old kid, she gets up in the morning at 5 in the morning. She lights the stove. She gets breakfast started. As they're eating, she goes out and milks the cows. She feeds the chickens, takes the goats out, takes the sheep out. Then she comes back in, washes the dishes. Then she cleans the house, the whole house, all the time, doesn't have any time for herself. And whenever she slows down for any particular reason, she gets a whack on the back of the head. She'll get hit with a piece of rawhide. And when the lady of the house, the mistress of the house, didn't feel fit to hit her, the youngest, all members of the house who were so inclined would knock her upside the head a couple of times too. They hastened her movements to make sure everything was done.
No one cares for me, only to get my work. And I feel sick. Who cares for that? Work as long as I can stand and then fall down and lay there till I can get up. No mother, father, brother, or sister to care for me. And then it's you lazy nigger, all because I'm black. Oh, if I could die.
In fact, they called her our Nig. Our Nig. We own our own Nig. And she belongs to us. No one else has her. We are unique.
One of the things that's important to think about is the isolation of enslaved New Englanders. And this is something that Harriet Wilson, who was in bondage, if not enslaved in New Hampshire, starting in the early 1830s, also experienced. To be one of the very few people without the cultural continuity, without the community ethics, without the religious and dance and musical and resistant traditions that get passed on when you're in a larger community, can make you quite isolated, and that isolation itself is a form of duress.
From the time when she was 6 up until the time she was about 21, Harriet suffered at the hands of these folks, essentially living as an indentured servant. But since we haven't found any papers essentially outlining the legal ramifications of her indenture, she could very well have been, as she herself thought of herself, as a slave in New Hampshire.
There was a house that we picked out was the right time, the right period, and then we started doing the research on that house. Because of some markers from the book, Wilson's book, there was a brook that she had, she'd jump over, and there was only one spot in the town where that could be. And I remember going up to the house one day, and the current owner was standing out there, and I said, well, let me go see. Let's see what happens. And I got out the door, and I went, and his name is David Palance. I said, "Hi, my name is," and I got the biggest hug.
I just embrace her and I just give her a big hug. And I'm like, "How are you? You know, it's nice to see you at the house." And she was just totally dumbfounded. She had no idea what was going on.
He thought I was somebody else.
And I thought it was Robin from church.
And I was telling him the story, and he got totally fascinated.
I didn't know anything about Arnig. I didn't know anything about the Harriet Wilson story. I'd learned it right there in my driveway.
He invited me in, we walked through, and then he later got the book, and he did the same thing I did, highlighted everything in the book that had a mention of a house, a description, any rooms, anything. And then he started plotting out things, and I remember he called me one day, "I think I found a missing room. I think I found a missing room because this doesn't fit. There's something missing."
Behind this door is now a brick wall, and there is a tunnel under the ceiling. If there was a ladder here, it would go right to this wall.
And he even tore a wall apart in his house.
And there is enough room that she could have crawled over this way to go into that same passageway. And in this wall above is where I found that doorway.
Every discovery made the story more alive.
So I ripped a section of the wall out, and I was able to put my arm in the hole with a mirror. And then when I flipped the mirror, I could see into this L, there was a doorway. And I could see that the little soffit, the little window at the end, and I'm like, I found it.
It was not yet quite dark, so they ascended the stairs without any light, passing through nicely furnished rooms, which were a source of great amazement to the child. He opened the door which connected with her room by a dark, unfinished passageway. "Don't bump your head," said Jack, and stepped before to open the door leading into her apartment, an unfinished chamber over the kitchen, the roof slanting nearly to the floor so that the bed could stand only in the middle of the room.
By titling her book Our Nig, she essentially told the world that, hey, these folks out here actually thought that they owned me. But I turned the tables on them. In a sense, when she says Our Nig, or sketches of a life of a free black in a two-story white house north, showing as slavery's shadows fall even there by our Nig. Harriet was essentially bringing slavery home to folks who couldn't understand it being in their backyard.
She really wanted to make clear in her novel that slavery wasn't just a Southern institution, it was here in the North, and she used her own story to tell that.
The only, if we consider it an autobiography, only autobiography of an indentured servant in the North at all. One of the few stories that tells the story of duress, that tension between abolition and horrible treatment of African Americans in that era in the North.
Ironically, the real family that Mrs. B represents is related to the Hutchinson family, who were prominent abolitionists in the town.
We despise oppression, we despise oppression, and we cannot be enslaved.
The Hutchinsons are huge in Milford. They just lived not 2 miles up the road. And they were so huge prior to the Civil War. And the oldest of the brothers, his name is David, he's one of the characters. He eventually owns this house. Just really unique because they're singing about anti-slavery. But then within the same family, his sister-in-law and his older brother were here at the house, you know, with an actual servant, a black servant.
Even though Harriet Wilson was able to publish her book in 1859, when you would have agitation upon agitation against slavery from the hotbed of abolition thought and action. At the height of the abolitionist movement, her book essentially just faded away, died on the vine.
I sincerely appeal to my colored brethren, universally for patronage, hoping they will not condemn this attempt of their sister to be erudite, but rally around me a faithful band of supporters and defenders. H.E.W.
When Skip Gates founded in the 1980s, it was as if a door was opened on that time period.
Remembered in 1982, and then forgotten, and then remembered again in in the town of Milford in 2002 when Miller wrote her article. So we were trying to get the book established in the schools, even Milford, in curriculum. And we found out that it was much harder than we thought. And a teacher wrote a response to that first article saying that Wilson was not forgotten, that basically they knew of the story. It's a book that needs to be studied at the college level, not at the high school level.
It's the story of a 5 and a 6 and a 7 and a 16-year-old girl. It's a perfect story, right, to be taught in either grammar school or high school.
We heard things like, well, if we put Wilson's book in, who are we going to take out? Are we going to take out, some of the, are we going to take out Hawthorne? Are we going to take out Little Women?
If, in fact, we've dealt with language that is not to our liking today with Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, we can deal with it for Harriet Wilson. This isn't the time, right, to say the title of a book should keep it out of classrooms where the story itself is deeply needed.
So her article just made me realize that there were all these stumbling blocks to getting the history out.
I had known about Harriet Wilson before I met Jerry Ann, but so it was exciting to see, here's this woman from Milford who is taking this story and making it real.
I started talking to her, and then just this whole other world opened up for the history.
And she just had such passion and energy that impressed me so much.
Valerie had created a Black Heritage Trail.
One of the things that we had decided we wanted to do was to put some plaques around town to say, okay, people, here's the Black history of Portsmouth. And we raised money quickly because people were fascinated with the stories. That's how it began.
I love the story around the African burying ground here in Portsmouth, because from the moment the signs were up, there was always a sign on a building as part of the tour saying that this ground here was the African burial ground. And then people were going, oh my gosh, we didn't know this was here. So even if we make that visible, our majority culture tends not to see it. So just so much as the people, we don't tend to see people of color. They become invisible in the majority culture. So their stories easily erased. We said, well, what can we do to make this visible and permanent, a permanent part of Milford's history, a permanent part of New Hampshire's history? And we said, well, we got to have something visible. We got to have a statue. So we decided to build a statue. When we decided that we were going to do a monument, we wanted it to be on public property. We did run into a little roadblock at that level, saying that, well, we should put it on private property. Why don't we buy our own land and put the monument on it? And I said, no, this is a town event. So we really wanted her on town property. We filled the town hall with over 500 people. We had Henry Louis Gates come to town. We had a gospel group. We had the fanfare. We did a call for an artist, and we did a national search for an artist. And again, each time we did this, we could tell Wilson's story. In doing all the research too, we found all the places that had Black history in the town. And we had 17 sites that are still there, just the way when Wilson was there. After we got everybody on our side, there was one person who wasn't. So we got the majority vote, yes we can. We had the choices of 2 parks, and we picked this one because it's next to the church that Harriet Wilson couldn't go to, and because it would be a destination for people to really come and think about the history when they got to this spot and saw the monument. When we were making the monument for Harriet, it was very important to us that it be a person, that it had features, that it had face, that it was a woman. It was like bringing her to life, that it be realistic, a realistic monument that would represent Wilson. It brings the people themselves to life. And if it hadn't been for George, Harriet Wilson's son, the book would have never happened. It was that aha moment for us. Of course, he had to be a part of the monument. That's why she wrote the book. She said it in the book. It's to support myself and child.
Deserted by kindred, disabled by failing health, I am forced to some experiment which shall aid me in maintaining myself and child without extinguishing this feeble life.
Harriet's story is, I look at it as triumphing over adversity. She grew up in a very bad way, but she persevered. She made it through.
After Our Nig is written, she also launches this major hair care product.
From about the early 50s up until well into the 1870s, she was going about trying various ways, trying to make a living.
New York Times runs an ad offering 4,000 of her bottles for sale by a wholesaler.
A hairdressing magnet of sort, making the shampoo and the hairdressing and trying to make a decent living off of that.
She, Reginald Pitts and I discovered, was a spiritualist.
And later, of course, we know that she would give lectures.
She reinvents herself these 3 times. This is a tremendous record of success at a time where Black women's opportunities are extraordinarily limited. Even though she had been abandoned and orphaned and treated horribly by the family that was left to raise but instead exploited her, who managed to overcome both her physical trauma and her abandonment to find community and to find opportunity. So her story is an inspirational one.
Harriet Wilson left her mark. She wrote an extraordinarily original book that sank like a stone. Published in 1859, it sold minimally. In fact, it barely sold at all, unlike Jeremy Belknap or Sarah Joseph Hale, who had big audiences. Why? Well, in part, it antagonized the very people that might have bought it. It antagonized northern white abolitionists. It antagonized smug northern white church people. That's precisely the audience that might have bought the book. So Our Nig did not affect culture or society in its day, because Sarah Joseph Hale, in her book, Northwood, as had Jeremy Belknap in his History of New Hampshire, they established this baseline in literature for what New Hampshire was really like. They sort of sucker punched a waiting world with their vision of what rural New Hampshire was all about. The 1830s are a turning point, really a seminal decade in American race relations. The British abolished slavery in the British Caribbean. There was Nat Turner's rebellion in the South, in Virginia and North Carolina. There was this David Walker who sent this pamphlet in 1829 into the South that was meant to sort of incite the slaves. So there's a lot of discussion in the 1830s about race in the United States. And a group of well-intentioned people in northern New Hampshire, Canaan, New Hampshire, decided to found an academy, a private high school, which was then the norm, that would be open not only to white boys, which was the norm, but would be open to young women, girls as well as boys, and to people of color as well as whites.
The nation at this time was at the height of the anti-slavery agitation. During this month, anti-slavery riots had taken place in New York City and had been continued into New Jersey. The people of Canaan sympathized with both sides, and the line was as sharply drawn between the abolitionists of Canaan and their opponents as anywhere in the country.
Noyes Academy is founded in excitement by abolitionists, men and women, blacks and whites, are brought up to Canaan, New Hampshire.
And they recruited through the abolition networks in northern cities such as New York. They recruited students of color who had to ride on segregated transportation to get to northern New Hampshire. And they actually recruited some people who were brilliant people of color, like Henry Highland Garnett. He was one of the students there. Popular culture of the era, the newspaper, is just feeding a steady stream of racist diatribe to the good, God-fearing folk of New Hampshire.
It is said that one of the principal agitators of the slave question in this state, George Kimball Esquire, and his family, sit at a table with a half-dozen colored people, while a white girl attends upon them as servant. We do not wonder that the white people of Canaan should consider such an establishment a nuisance, and that they should adopt all lawful measures for its removal.
Townsend raised the question, why should a white girl, a white farm girl from the local region hired by the school to, in effect, work in the kitchen, should she serve a young man of color at the table? Why should a white girl act like a servant to a black boy? Things like this just upset the local apple cart. So after a while, a group of good-hearted Congregationalist townsmen decided that they could not have this viper's nest in their town.
On July 4th, townspeople, not only from Canaan but from surrounding areas, meet to talk literally about the honor of the state and the safety of the community.
Therefore resolved that from what our own eyes have seen and our ears have heard, respecting the close intimacy that exists between some of the colored boys and white females, we believe if suffered to go on, it will not be long before we shall have living evidence of an amalgamation of blood. Resolved that we consider the colored school in this town a public nuisance, and that it is the duty of the town to take immediate measures to remove said nuisance.
So they meet on July 4th, declare their patriotism, and then by August, bring almost 100 yoke of oxen up and take the school itself off of its foundation.
A mob came with teams of oxen and chains, lots of oxen, and literally took the schoolhouse and dragged it off its foundations and pulled it down the main road of the town.
Think about what it means on an August day to take your oxen out of the fields and meet your neighbors and bring them all together and rope a building. And then all these oxen will have to work together under your collective direction. To then be active in pulling out the town cannon. The town cannon.
The cannon was then dragged through the street and discharged at the house of every abolitionist, breaking glass in abundance at every discharge.
Henry Highland Garnett, who will later write the 1843 address to slaves, who says, "Remember, you are 4 million." He pulls out his gun and shoots as they're retreating on a wagon at the whites who have their cannon out. And here he is literally having to fend off people who care so deeply about racial exclusion that they will violently enact their will against people who are there just to learn. What does that mean?
Later, some of the scholars, like Henry Highland Garnett, would invoke this to point out how rabid racism was even in the far north of a supposedly all-white state like New Hampshire. The roots ran deep.
So when we talk about New Hampshire being an all-white state, we're also talking about all of the blacks that were driven out of New Hampshire, who were discouraged by warning outs, a system that warned poor people out of towns throughout New Hampshire. so that they could not start families, could not feel included, would not feel wanted, and would move along to other places.
People have to remember, too, that even though New England was the hotbed of abolitionism, you would find that not all New Englanders were abolitionists. And the perfect case in point is Hillsborough, New Hampshire's favorite son, President Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce essentially has gone down as one of our worst United States presidents because, again, he was what they called a doughface, a northern man who supported slavery. And there were a lot of folks who were like Franklin Pierce. You had merchants attempting to placate the South in order to keep getting the cotton for the mills or the sugar for the refineries in Salem.
The white European immigrants would get the jobs. There were no black people working in the factories, in the mills. It was hard for a black person to get any kind of a job because if you were hiring somebody, you would hire a white person. So most of the black people who were still living here were older people who perhaps would not be so inclined to move and start life anew someplace else, and they were self-employed. And there was no motivation for younger people to stay here. They would leave. They would go to someplace where they could find work and where they could find a more vibrant social life. Not unlike today.
I must say that each and every one of the contractors I've met with and we've gone out for beers has been excited about this challenge. When you're designing site work like this, there's these various stages of, oh my gosh, when this giant flatbed truck shows up at the studio and all of the work that you've been laboring on for all of these years gets put on the back of this truck, and you're looking at the truck driver and you're saying, this person could either run off the highway because he's pissed at his wife or something, or he's going to get to work there safely.
Attach them to the other board. If we do it all nice and flat,
The Sankofa symbol, and that disc has a large Sankofa image on it, which means go back and get it. In other words, we should always be thinking about what has happened in the past so that we learn from the successes and the failures as we move forward. The souls underneath that street have been waiting for their honor, and I think that those spirits are at work here to make sure that things are going to go as they should be so that they can finally have the honor that they're due. They're probably working on it right now.
We get fascinated with the idea that there was slavery here, and then we forget the more recent history of racial discrimination, which is an ongoing problem. We have people in the 1920s who were struggling to get full recognition here in Portsmouth. Elizabeth Virgil had come to Portsmouth at the age of 7 with her mother and sisters. And when I was interviewing her, she was in her 80s. She had a phenomenal memory. But what was especially important about Elizabeth Virgil was that when she graduated from Portsmouth High School, her mother was working for a couple white women in Portsmouth who at that time were leaders in the suffragist movement. Elizabeth Virgil was able to get scholarships to attend University of New Hampshire. And Elizabeth became the first black graduate from the University of New Hampshire. She was a teacher, certified to teach. However, of course, we're talking about the 1920s. She couldn't teach in Portsmouth. There was no classroom in this state or most places in New England that would allow a black teacher to teach their children. So she went south and taught in the segregated South until some years later when she moved back to Portsmouth. She still couldn't get a job as a teacher. She got a job with a civil service job as a clerk typist at the shipyard, and then later as a secretary at the University of New Hampshire, where she retired as a secretary. And she had taught Sunday school at the Black Church, People's Baptist Church. She taught African stories, poetry, even plays. She made sure that they understood their African heritage. And her portrait now hangs in Diamond Library. So fortunately, we do have that distinction.
Industrial soldiers on the march. Workers drawn to new centers of industrial activity by the demands of national defense. Workers in the factories, the shipyards, and the arsenals discharge their duties. At home, their families have their jobs too. The American way of life.
We have throughout the 30s and 40s, when there was restricted housing, you couldn't get a job as a professional person in the city of Portsmouth, couldn't get a job in a public school as a teacher. You could go get a degree from the University of New Hampshire or Dartmouth College as a professional person, but you couldn't work at your profession here. You had to go to the South or to some large city that had a large black neighborhood.
There was a church group at St. John's Church, which started in 1960. That organization was called SCORE, Seacoast Council on Religion and Race. We met in the basement of St. John's Church. Valerie was one of the members. And as a result of that, several projects were entered into. Of course, at that time, the Wentworth by the Sea was not integrated in any way. And there was a wonderful effort made by a man named Hugh Potter and his wife, Jean, who went to the Wentworth with their friends, Mr. and Mrs. Emerson Reed, who were black.
And the four of them, then with the Unitarian minister and his wife as witnesses and all, they planned to try to forcibly integrate one of the most high-end Tony restaurants on the seacoast, the Wentworth by the Sea.
And they went on the 4th of July.
They prepaid for the dinner. And then he and his wife got there first and sat down, and then Emerson Reed and his wife, the black couple, dressed to the nines, showed up and said to the maitre d', we have reservations for dinner, at which point the maitre d' freaked out. Meanwhile, the activists had planted other people around the room, including the local Unitarian minister, to be witnesses and to take notes on this if it went to court. So it was all very well thought out.
Eventually, they were seated. But it was very difficult for the Smiths, who were the owners of the Wentworth at that time, but they did seat them very close to the kitchen.
New Hampshire was full of segregation, as was Maine, in the 40s, 50s, into the mid-60s. I mean, there were books set out for the colored traveler so that they could navigate from place to place where they could get a meal, get a coffee, have a room, use the bathroom. They were not welcome in hotels, restaurants, bathrooms in gas stations. They just knew the drill. I mean, that you didn't go into certain restaurants, you couldn't go into certain barbershops, you couldn't get certain services because you were a black person. The existence of the Rock Rest Guest House in Kittery was one of these guest houses where people of color could go spend a summer holiday.
I remember Rock Rest, and I liked the Sinclairs very much. They were wonderful members of SCORE. And of course, that was the opportunity to make this wonderful inn, which was basically for black people to come from the city to have some time in the country. While we were working together at SCORE, we learned of two black guys who were imprisoned at the Portsmouth Naval Prison, which is sort of an icon. It's this huge building which has been the naval prison for years until it was closed probably 20 years ago now. But at the time we heard that there were two black guys imprisoned there, one of whom had been sentenced to, I think, 10 years and the other to 6.
And they were at Camp Pendleton in California, and sometime off duty, you know, after hours, whatever, they were, you know, shooting the bull with some other guys and ranting about how this is a white man's war and no black man should go to Vietnam and shoot people of color and, you know, stuff like that, riffing, right? Somebody overheard them. They got court-martialed, convicted in 18 minutes or something, and sentenced to 6 years and 10 years in the Portsmouth Naval Prison, which was then the Fort Leavenworth for the U.S. Navy.
We began in April, and we would march once a month. And then probably in July, I came home one day and I could smell this odor of aerosol, and I thought, what is that? And I went downstairs and my husband was spray painting a sail that said, "Free Harvey and Daniels." And we pinned it to the sail that we had on our boat, and we sailed outside the prison, back and forth, back and forth.
Tacked back and forth in the river in front of the shipyard just to piss off the prison people.
Until the Coast Guard came and told us we would have to get off the river. Well, how do you get off the river anyway? And there were a lot of fists coming out of the windows waving at us. And I thought at the time they probably were all in support of us. I suspect some now were thinking, why don't you mention us?
A larger group organized this march that went from Portsmouth across Memorial Bridge, met by Marines with fixed bayonets and, you know, little white girls from Durham saying, "Mommy, why are the soldiers pointing their guns at us?"
They knew we were coming. We never tried to surprise anybody. And this fire engine came up carrying Marines. A little 3-year-old boy said to his father, "Daddy, where is the fire?" And his father said, "We are the fire." It was exciting. And then one day in September, with absolutely no fanfare, they were just released. And down Woodman Road, my street, came this group of Black Panthers, just sort of singing and swaying and very joyful and excited and dancing down the street. It was great fun, and they came in and had a very lively party here, and Harvey and Daniel spent the night here, and I think their mothers did too. During the party, I went downstairs because Tom was down there, and I looked up, and the rafters were swaying because of the music and the dancing upstairs. It was wonderful.
You know, I grew up at a time when, on a personal level, you know, during the civil rights movement and, you know, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the Kennedys and you know, there it was. There was that anger, there was that struggle, you know, there was that unearthing of truths. But it all seemed to yield this positive forward movement where, you know, we got beyond the anger and said the objective is to create a beloved community, to use Martin Luther King's words.
The 44th President of the United States of America, President.
And then to have President Obama in town speaking any place, but especially at Strawberry Bank, my neighborhood, it felt pretty damn good.
Oh, it is good to be back in Portsmouth.
It makes me feel that perhaps all of the efforts, the tears and concern that my parents and other Portsmouth Black people had in struggling to make this a better place.
But I must say, it's rather frustrating because when you were directly involved, you know how much effort was put into that. And you wonder, gosh, if that didn't take us over the top, over that tipping point, and we're yet sliding back down, what will?
So our committee thought it was very important
to involve the young people in the community in the project?
We would choose like the symbol we wanted and like what emotion we wanted to convey.
And then they like put it through some sort of machine and printed it onto the tile.
So when you're standing in that plaza, you're surrounded 180 degrees by these ceramic tiles that children have created.
They learned that there were slaves in Portsmouth and New Hampshire, first of all.
It was surprising, and it's nice that we're like remembering them. It's really cool to be able to like contribute to something like this.
They were very moved by the idea that human beings were buried and not given the respect they should have had.
Because it's not good to pave right over it, and we can't do that.
They were really appropriately appalled.
I think it's cool that we're part of something that's so permanent or that's going to be here for a long time that like means something to more than just us and to everyone else around in the city and all over the world.
And it's important to our whole community that you were involved and that you took a part in the project, and that you will now continue to tell others the story of this site for many years to come.
This is a student-led project in which students are interacting with primary documents. The main document that they're working with is the 1779 Petition for Freedom by African American enslaved people of Portsmouth.
Americans wanted their freedom, and so, by association, their slaves wished for their freedom.
I feel like we're handling what the past generation of us messed up, and we're making things right, finally, 234 years later.
My voice has been joined by all of your voices. And one of the powerful things about art is that it can, in fact, connect the past with the present and therefore project us into a very promising future. So involving the voices of young people, your voices, is essential. And not only your voices, but your voices speaking with respect to the Adinkra symbols, the kente cloth, images and motifs and proverbs that relate to those souls that were buried here.
I call them the community figures, figures that would represent the contemporary community. And then on the surface of each of those figures is the line from a poem that I wrote. The first line of it is, "We stand for the ancestors here and beyond." And then the second line is, "We stand for those who are angry." One of the main issues here with enslavement was the separation of families, of people, of a kind. And the life-size figures, in terms of that story about separating people, that wall became the impact, the mindset that comes in and says, we have the right, the audacious right, to take you and pull you apart. On one side of that wall is a female figure. She became a representation of Mother Africa. Her position would be one of almost kind of, how dare you? Stop and think about what you're doing. And then on the opposite side is the male figure representing that first enslaved person brought into Portsmouth. He was the most difficult or the most challenging because the question was, what does his face convey? Since they're on street level, and this was intentional, that they're not elevated up, you approach them as you would approach anybody else in Portsmouth, eye-to-eye contact. You think you know the story. But to the extent that this was a very specific way of making a statement, my first inclination was, this guy had every reason to be completely pissed, if I may say so. I mean, you're pulled out of your home, you're put on a boat in conditions that I don't even want to imagine. If you survive that, then you're brought into this new land You have no idea where you are, what you're doing there, how to communicate. And then all of a sudden this white stuff starts falling out of the sky that you've never experienced before. It gets deathly cold. So, I spent a good several weeks personally trying to work through what I would have thought would have been his anger and his fear. So I had to work through that anger and find something that would speak to a hint of that, a hint of vulnerability, and yet at the same time, he was capable, they were all capable of finding the strength to endure this.
The slaves on the plantation told his story. When freed, we told our story. Yes, they brought us here. And these warriors who survived under trying and difficult circumstances, who did not come in a luxury cabin on a cruise ship, but came like cargo in a hold and survived. And we came to help build this nation. America built upon the backs of those brought to a strange land. But here in 2015, 370 years later, we assemble here to honor our forefathers who for years were walked upon when they paved that sacred lot. Now, don't get mad at me, but the truth is, we pride ourselves in New England with historic cemeteries. We put out guides for tourists to come and see our historic cemeteries, never saying that beneath the pavement we trod upon, there's a people buried in a ground just as sacred as the other cemetery. I'm so glad to be a part of this fair city. Thank God Almighty, we're standing up tonight. Bless you, you who came and paved the way and survived. We honor you tonight. This vigil is for you.
I've been working with these individuals for a really long time, and I've had a sense that they've spoken a little bit to me over the years. And it came to me that we were saying goodbye to these individuals, and we'd asked these men to serve as pallbearers for these individuals they didn't really know. And I'd written a report, and the report's all scientific and forensic, but I saw or felt in that moment that this was the last time that people were really going to get to know who those individuals were.
I heard about Valerie before I actually met her. You know what I mean? And then she's the one that asked me to be a pallbearer. Being involved in the burial ground was definitely emotional for me because I felt like this was my history. This was our history.
Knowing what I knew of them based on the science and my own experience in taking them out of the ground, I felt it was really important to just say goodbye to each one of those individuals, as well as introducing them to the men that were going to take them and put them in the vault.
This is the man that I called Uncle. He was an older man. And on top of his coffin was a child. We don't know whether it was male or female. Number 7 was on top, of number 12. So as it comes off the caisson, number 12 will come first, and then number 7 will follow. And these 2 boxes have been made so they stack one on top of the other, so they will go back into the ground the same way we found them in 2003.
It's just so important that people are remembered for the contributions and the work and the struggle, the separation of families, like all of that stuff was not for nothing.
My name is Jerome Meadows, and I have never felt more honored. Thank you, Portsmouth. My objective right now is to bring the final completion of the artistic statements that have been done in behalf of those souls whose remains are about to be returned to the earth and those who have remained here. So it's my pleasure to unveil the sculptural elements. I present to you the community figures. They are us. And they are proclaiming, again, that all human beings are given equal protection, equal respect, and equal opportunity. Thank you. I've been walking along the petition line that would connect one end of the memorial to the other. In so doing, it seemed obvious that that could contain a sense of history. We determined that excerpts from the petition submitted by 20 enslaved people would be an appropriate text to have on the petition line.
They did not ask simply for their own personal freedom. In their petition, these 20 men also asked that, quote, the name of slave be known no more.
May no more be heard in a land gloriously contending for the sweets of freedom.
Today, we carry your bones and your remains to be placed in a grave and cave of honor. These ancestors were not afraid to show themselves, for they are in need to be recognized. We're not here to mourn them. We're here to heal the dead, to return them. We're here to bury them as our ancestors. Our ancestors. On this stone and this cave, you will find peace and be remembered always. As we return these bones of our ancestors to the grave, we beseech you, O Chineke Nna, O God, to grant them a quiet resting place. Now, We commit these human remains to the ground. Ntu nara ntu. Etum nara etum. Igwugwu nara igwugwu. Maka na ọ bụ igwugwu na ntụ na aja ka anyị si bịa. Dust to dust, earth to earth, ashes to ashes. May the Almighty grant you an everlasting peace.
Oh, gee.
It was very moving.
Moving, yeah.
You see, she's moved.
Yeah. I'm just, so overwhelmed.
What's happening here today is historic. It's absolutely moving.
For the remains, the love and just the way people carried the coffins in, and the music and the speech, and it was very moving.
This is a big deal. It felt really good to be a part of history, because that's exactly what this is.
We don't even know their names, and in some ways it's ironic that you can treat the remains of these people with such respect when a lot of times actual people that we have the we have the opportunity to treat them with respect today, because we don't necessarily take I think that's a lost opportunity, and it's great to see people just take that opportunity today, I think.
I feel that the whole world should be here right now. But I'm fortunate because through DNA, we actually found where my mother's ancestors came from. We made the trip to Africa, to Nigeria. We found our king, our village. We stood on the very riverbank where my mother's people walked into slavery. We stood on that very riverbank.
These people came here on ships from the West Indies and Africa. And those ships stopped in Newport and New Bedford and Boston and Salem and Portsmouth and Portland. And people were sold from those ships in a marketplace. Who would do the work? You start a new land based upon the principles of freedom, the ability to pray to and how one would wish, and the economics of it. People decide to enslave 10 to 15 million Africans in the slave trade. And that means that those born in Africa and the West Indies and here in Portsmouth and other places came here, but they had family that they left behind. And they had family in those other ports. And they had family that at a point constituted enough people of African descent, because they called themselves Africans, that the determination was made to separate them in their burial in an African burial ground. We all know all too well what is going on today in this country. It's been going on for a long time. You don't simply rip someone from their loved one's arms and make them disappear from history. America's amnesia is deliberate. And your actions here over more than a decade are deliberate. You have decided to remember something that is deeply difficult to reconcile. As we celebrate this country's liberty and freedom and justice in documents that are beautiful to understand and live out, we have to understand that that freedom has not been accorded to everyone. We must understand this history, or we continue to be confounded by how we live together. Looking out over this crowd, you have done something amazing today by being here. By witnessing this today, you stand as family, as community. Place matters. People matter. And so, given that I do this kind of work every day, I would ask those of you who know Valerie and Jerry Ann and all of the others who have made this happen, that they continue to need your love and support and honesty and openness, talent and treasure to continue to research and hold up this history. This doesn't end here. This is a beginning. It is still in front of us to find out who they were and to pay homage to the life that they lived, the economy that they powered, and the kindness they displayed in the face of utter horror. We are going to go from this place better people, connected to one another by having experienced this blessed, sacred moment in history. But understand that beneath our feet are the lives of beautiful people who did nothing more than find themselves kidnapped to do the work of democracy.
This is our story. This happened. This is our past. This is the story we have to tell. It's not all pull yourself up by your bootstrap. It's not all work hard and you'll succeed. It's not all the North was a refuge for the slaves, the enslaved. It's not all a Southern story versus a Northern story. It's an American story. You know, what does it mean that there was slavery in New Hampshire? We'd first have to admit that there was slavery in New Hampshire. We'd have to look at the story of slavery. What does it mean that a person of color was warned out of town as soon as they came in? Unless you look back at where we've been or what the real story is, you can't grapple with that story. It will always be kind of fake values, unless you can say, well, this really happened. If we stick to just a myth, it's not reality.
The Black history of New Hampshire has been ignored. It's been here all the time. It's not hidden. It's right out there, but it's ignored.
We don't do anything to promote it. We don't include it in our story. And each time we don't include it, it's a part of erasing it again.
I'm just honored to be here with all of you today. And it is a particular privilege to be here to sign such an important law, even if it is a law that is centuries overdue.
And that action is that the Confederate flag is coming off the grounds of the South Carolina State House.
We're more visual people than literary. They see that flag, they know exactly what they're looking at. Having other things to look at is paramount.
And this is why what I call sort of historical activists like Jerry Ann Bogus, like Valerie Cunningham, who are creating ways of remembering that are inclusive, that are truthful.
So that people can see, people can understand and realize that, unlike the flag, it's not going away.
Symbolism is important, but it is my hope that we do not forget about the other men, the women, and the children who were enslaved in the state of New Hampshire at the time of this petition.
Okay. Get over there. Yeah.
Lined up, Ron?
Yes.
1, 2, easy, fellas, because it's going to slide. 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
I feel blessed to bear witness to this story.
So I don't know, it's just got all of this beginningness about it in terms of something that's profoundly important, not just for the Portsmouth community, but I think there's aspects of this that should be taken to other communities.
We interact with our friends and our neighbors. I'm reminded in various ways every single day of my life that I am of African descent and that I have African American heritage. People who are of European and other origins need to become aware of what that means in their lives daily. What kind of privilege or oppression do they have because of their own status, whatever that might be.
It's a shared story, and the more we recognize it as a shared story, the more we dialogue about it, the more we see each other as humans, the more we see each other having the same desires, hope, dreams, and wishes, the more we can fulfill the promise of what America could be.
I mean, it's not easy. And it's not fun a lot of times, although, I mean, it's not all tragedy. Let's not get too morose about this. We're here to celebrate as much as we are part of the remembering is the celebration. It's who we are, so that's why it's important.
As we had put the lid on the vault, we weren't really closing a story, we were opening up a way for a new dialogue.
It's hard to put words on it. Sealing that vault. But this time those souls are guaranteed not to be disturbed again.
her face.
To me, that's the most powerful statement. It is, it perfumes what is
Walk up straight through the roof, straight through the hole in the ceiling. Take your place in the sky. Oh, look around at the clouds that hold you, that hold you. And the birds surround you, the birds surround you, they circle you and make a tornado from the air. Oh, it feels just like you dreamed, just like you dreamed. Oh, your shoulders are clear. They have given up the weights and the knots, the weights and the knots, the weights and the knots. No more gravity around you, no more gravity, no more gravity. And in a funny way, you identify with the piece of paper you saw floating down the street earlier in the day. Who knew this? Who knew this would be easy? Who knew it is would be easy? And you suddenly think of the kings and the poets in the past, and how they must have felt just like this on a day like this, on a day like this. Oh,